I wanted to make this video because I've seen a few YouTube videos discussing English identity, the Anglo-Saxons, uh, our national identity, how that was created, who we are as a people. Um, and I wanted to kind of give some historical context because I feel like these videos, in a way, they reinforce this idea of national identity in a very black and white way, where they don't really discuss the nuance involved. Um, in particular, I want to start by discussing the history of the English people. Most people's understanding and what these videos talk about is, the Anglo-Saxons were from mainland Germany, northern Germany, Denmark, uh, the Jutland Peninsula, and when Rome began to collapse, the Romans left Britain, and the British were, in the British Isles, and the Anglo-Saxons migrated over and basically began to replace the native British people and drove them into Wales and Cornwall, and then created the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And then those kingdoms were fighting amongst themselves. They were like smaller units, and then Wessex came on top and basically took over. And then you have the Vikings come over, and they managed to fight off the Vikings and until the Normans came, which many people correctly point out that the Normans weren't exactly French. They were sort of a blend of kind of Viking and French, Vikings with French culture, I guess. And then that then began the new era of kind of the old Anglo-Saxon to English, where, we had the Middle English language that was a mix of Norman French and Old English. What these videos don't discuss, which is very important, is we tend to have, and people tend to have, a very anachronistic approach to national identity. Now, what I mean by that is that we really struggle not to put modern concepts, ideas of what it means to have an ethnic identity to the past. And we do this with everything. We're very anachronistic in general. We find it hard to really put people in their own context, in their own time, and realize that people didn't see the world that we necessarily see the world. And a big issue that I have is that these videos very rarely talk, or never, they never talk about this anachronistic view of the past. So if you were to watch these videos, you would learn that, there's these northern Germanic people. They come over, they migrate, they take over. They're the English, basically. They're our ancestors. The issue right from the get-go is even using words like Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Saxons, etc. You have to understand that when we use these words, we're taking these names from very scant sources. And very often they're not from the people themselves. We don't know what they mean. We don't know who they exactly refer to. And what I mean by that is when we use the term Anglo-Saxon to mean Angles and Saxons, two tribes very similar from northern Germany that came over together and took over, what would later become England. We do not know exactly who these people were. We don't know if they were, if they shared exactly the same language, or they had different dialects, if they were in political unity. We don't know. For example, I came across something recently where I had an idea. where the Romans referred to these people as Saxons. And as many of you know, or at least the people who are watching this video probably already know, that Saxon is related to the long knife, the seax or sax, which was a real kind of supposedly cultural indicator of a Saxon. Now, I believe that it's possible that the word Saxon to mean, that they carry this knife, could have been someone else calling them that. And then they then adopted that name that other people were calling them. Saxon, in my view, could just as easily be a tribal name as it could be a name for a group of people that fall into a certain description, for example, as raiders, as pirates, by the Romans or the British Romans, Romano-British. Just like we call the Vikings, and, in other circumstances, they could have adopted that name for themselves and said, oh, I'm a Viking. They didn't, but it's possible. And for a long time, now people have really kind of clued in, and they're saying Viking doesn't mean, it's not an ethnic indicator. It means a profession. It means that you're raiding, you're going Viking. Now, why don't you apply that to something that we so readily say, oh, Saxon, no, that's an ethnic identifier. It could just as easily be, from its origin, actually, oh, those are Saxons, those are people of the knife. They attack people, they're raiders. And then later, they then adopted that name for themselves. Possibly not, probably not. Just an idea. And just a kind of a little taste of what it means to be uncertain about where names come from, why people are called those things, and what they actually mean for those people that we identify as Saxon. So just as easily, they could have been a group of different tribes that were called, again, Saxon, as a kind of a group, that had decided to work together. Now, we don't know those individual tribal identities, if there were, within that Saxon epithet. We look at the Angles and we think, did they know themselves as Angles? Did they call themselves Angles? Or was it a later name that they adopted for themselves? All we have to go on is some scant sources that are people who are called the Angles and Saxons migrated from northern Germany, probably, to the British Isles in the early medieval period. Now, there's already been a lot of discussion about what kind of migration this was. Was it a slow migration? Was it a quick migration? Was it a complete takeover, a genocide, where they just completely wiped out the local British native population and took over and settled there? There's arguments about perhaps it being a replacement of the upper strata of society, very much like the Norman invasion later. It could have been just like that, where, a few powerful warriors came over, conquered, took over the land, essentially, but ruled over a British population with their families. Alternatively, drove out the British people and pushed them into, Wales and Cornwall. It's very likely to be a mix of these things, in my opinion. And I think that we can actually glean that if we do look at, I'm one of those people that I feel like we've had this interesting kind of pendulum swing where, in the past, scholars tended to kind of take their historical sources at face value, and they said, well, look, this historian said this, the Venerable Bede said this, so let's just take that at face value. And then later, more recently, there was this kind of swing in the opposite direction where it was like, no, like you have to scrutinize them. You have to kind of be like, yeah, but did they have any bias? Are they just making stuff up? Like, and basically scrutinizing everything. And now I kind of feel like, I don't know, for me personally, I tend to err on the other side again, where I'm more willing to take historians at face value unless I've got compelling reasons to not take them at face value. Maybe that's just my personality. Like I take people at face value. If they tell me something, then I'm more willing to trust them than not. But that it is what makes it interesting when you read these historical sources about, what we learn about the Angles and Saxons coming over to Britain and what happened. There's a story of Vortigern, King Vortigern, the Romano-British king, and inviting over Hengist and Horsa, the Saxon brothers, who many historians now say, oh, they're mythical figures, it's the two brothers, we see that in Castor and Pollux in, Roman mythology, or is it Greek? I can't remember. It's very mythologized and everything. It's kind of like the founding fathers of a people, that don't really exist. Personally, I would rather take it at face value and say, hey, why not? Like maybe there were, there was a lot less people back in the day, less populated. Maybe there were these two, powerful brothers who led a group of followers over, and in that period, those Germanic people, they did seek out employment. If there weren't any wars going on, this was a very kind of militaristic society. If you didn't have wars going on within your own geographic locality, within your own tribes, there wasn't really much chance for advancement if you were born into that kind of upper warrior aristocracy. So potentially you would have to go out and seek someone who would employ you as a warrior, fight in their battles, or go and raid abroad. And I think that that's entirely possible, that there were two brothers called Hengist and Horsa, who may be slightly stylized, who knows, that came over with a small group of followers, even 50 men would basically be an army in that period. They talk about this in a much later Anglo-Saxon period of what it means to be an army. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it's crazy. The source is something like, 4 men are thieves, up to 7 men is a band, and more than 25 men is an army. Something like that. I'll have to look it up, but I can't be bothered right now. But it just goes to show like how these small numbers really do have a big impact in this period. So if you've even got, one ship, 2 warrior brothers with one ship, with, who knows, 25 to 50 men, that makes a big difference. If you go to some kind of local king and say, hey, like I've got a bunch of professionally, armed men who can fight for you, do you want us? And that's what happens. They, according to the history, they come over and they go into the service of Vortigern, and he gives them, rewards. And I think he gives Kent to the brothers to have, which so then, or I believe it's Kent, I'm not sure. But my own view of it is that it's entirely possible that it began as just these kind of small raiding parties or a small group of warriors that came over in the employment of a king like Vortigern, and were given land basically to kind of set up shop. And in all likeliness, if it was just this small group of warrior elite if they brought over their families later, or if they married local women, then that is an example of kind of replacing the upper strata in a way. Within a larger British system, Romano-British system, a small cluster of men who were not from there, they were Northern Germanic, being the nobility in a certain area like Kent, and kind of having that as their kind of, kingdom, or not kingdom, like a, fiefdom, I guess. Then it's entirely possible that later, they said, like in the history, that they started inviting more guys over and more guys, and then eventually they ended up going to war. And there's a great story about where they have a peace treaty with Vortigern, and they decide to meet up with King Vortigern and his nobles, and basically they tell their men to hide their long knives in I think in their shoes or something. I'm not sure. And they go in and they feast with all these nobles of Britain, and then when the time is right, I'm not sure if it is Hengist and Horsa. I think it is, or maybe one of them. But they basically say like right now, and they all pull out their knives and they kill all the nobility of Britain, and then they have Vortigern, and they say, right, we want more land, and that's the beginning of the end, really, of kind of the British kind of Romano-British control of what would later become England. Again, I see no reason. It could be a dramatization, it could be complete fiction, but I see no reason not to say, why not? Why isn't that possible? It's a story. Like, maybe it does have some, semblance of truth. It's also my opinion that it's possible. I like to imagine that maybe the Essex coat of arms was inspired by that night. A blood red shield with 3 sea axes on it, symbolizing the night where they killed, the British nobility with their long knives, their sea axes, their saxes, where they get the name. So then from that point, you could have then had, more migration, and I'm sure in certain areas, they perhaps just replaced the upper strata of the nobility, especially if they had, these pitched battles. Romano Britain in this period had fallen into this kind of tribal society. And it was very hierarchical. You would have had an upper strata of nobility, perhaps a certain kind of maybe 20% or something of the population being like free men, sort of yeomen in the later period, from where you draw the kind of your warriors. And then everyone below that, either, peasants or what we would later call peasants, tenanted farmers, and slaves. Slavery was a massive thing then. It would have made up possibly between 10 and 30% of the population, which is insane. It's a huge number. But that's even more reason to expect that it's, that they could replace this upper strata, because if everyone else, even if they have a different identity, different language, it's basically replacing your landlord. You have different landlords. The rich guys, the wealthy elite, all go off and have this big battle, and then these guys win, and they say, right, this is our land now. Well, why would you get rid of all your tenanted farmers? Why would you get rid of all of the slaves there? You wouldn't. You'd leave them. You'd say, well, stay there, stay on your land. I'm your new landlord. You now owe me allegiance, and I'm going to take over. That's entirely possible that happened in a lot of areas. It's also possible that in other areas, there was more of a kind of an escape, perhaps, while the Romano-British elite were there and they saw these guys coming, they would say, right, we're getting out of here, and they all flee, people flee, to prevent being raided and attacked. And then you would have seen higher numbers of actual migration of people actually coming over and settling, ordinary families, not just the elite warrior class. So it's my belief that across what would later become England, there was probably a variety of different kinds of settlement in what would later become England. But the reason why I'm saying all this is to try and get across the point of what it means to be ethnically English. When we say, oh, I'm Anglo-Saxon, these are my ancestors, the Anglo-Saxons, what exactly do we mean? Because we now know through genetic data that the western part of England is only something like 50% origin in North Germany, which means that there was a massive mix of local British people and Northern Germanic Anglo-Saxon people, integrating, intermarrying. But what happened was that it was the language and the culture of the Anglo-Saxons that, and even then we're not 100% sure, because how can we? How do we know without a doubt that the culture that we're looking at was completely from Northern Germany and there wasn't any British influence? We can't completely know that for sure. So even then when we say, oh, well, it's in Anglo-Saxon culture, what do we mean? It could be a mix. It could be a mix of British culture, Anglo-Saxon culture, but then we, looking back with an anachronistic approach, say that's Anglo-Saxon culture because we're describing what we see at the time. But those people living in that period may not have seen it that clearly. We know that they didn't say, oh, I'm an Anglo-Saxon. That's a really important thing to point out that I want to say is people in that period did not call themselves Anglo-Saxons. Okay? So the term Anglo-Saxon was something used by the Wessex monarchy later when they started to take over the other kingdoms. They started to call themselves King of the Anglo-Saxons, in a way saying kings of the Angles and the Saxons. So clearly there was an understanding that these were two groups, the Angles and the Saxons, that were kind of very similar because they both came from Northern Germany. But this was still a term that was employed by the monarchy to create a sense of unity, to say, this is one people, local people probably had much more local understandings of identity. So, you got to understand that, when we look back at these kind of periods, even in later medieval periods, this is true, but especially true in early medieval periods, people had different understandings of identity. They didn't have these big, broad stroke understandings of this is my nationality. Fred over there, 100 miles away, is also like me, and we share the same national identity. No. It was all about serving people. Okay? So, their understanding of their world was very much predicated upon their relationship with their neighbors, with their peers, with those beneath them and with those above them. Everyone had a lord, essentially. Everyone needed to belong to a group. So, the king would be at the top, or the chief, and then they would have their kind of their think of it more like a crime family, because that's really what it was. You got these kind of powerful, strong types at the top who kind of, go to battle, who protect but also attack, and then you have, they're basically landlords, you would identify by saying, I serve this person, this is my lord. Now, for sure, there would have been an understanding of tribal affiliations, family affiliations, but try and think of it as like much more local. Like, I'm here, I have my family, this is my family, we know each other. This is my local area, we're part of the same group, we speak the same language, we know each other. We all rely upon each other for protection, and this is our land. And then we have these kind of, depending on where you're on the strata, you have these guys above you. You might be a tenanted farmer, you might be a slave if you belong to someone else. But ultimately, the noble family is at the top. They are the noble kin, and that's where, often when we talk about these names of tribes, something really fascinating is how connected they are to the family. The family at the top. And when we talk about, oh, there's this tribe and that tribe and this clan, it all derives from the name of the family that are ruling that area, those people that live under this leading family, and then the outsiders say, oh, this is these guys, like the Corleones, like, oh, those are the Corleones. Now, not everyone in that crime family are literally Corleone. There are many people who work under them. There are the worker ants, then the kind of middle guys, and then the higher up you go, they start to kind of be connected to the family, where they're like, oh, I'm married to the cousin of the guy and this guy and that guy. Oh, I'm not related. I just kind of came in and I served them because I'm a follower and I want to, be successful and everything. But at the top, there's the Corleone family, the head of the family, then his kind of sons, and that would have been more how these kind of groups worked. It wasn't until much later periods where you start to see this kind of idea of nationality start to kind of really take place, really start to develop. So again, when we talk about, I'm an Anglo-Saxon, what does that mean? Especially when we have, this idea of, for example, when people talk about the Welsh, they say, oh, the Welsh, they're the British, they're the natives of this island, they're the originals, and it's like, no, it's not as simple as that. It really is not as simple as that, because when you do start to consider the idea that it's not just possible, but very, very likely that the Anglo-Saxons didn't just come over and just completely genocide an entire population of God knows how many people, 2 million people, which is almost impossible in that period. It's much more likely that that there was this kind of gradual mix of the people who were already there, the Romano-British, with the kind of migrating / invading Anglo-Saxon people. And then these British people slowly started to amalgamate and adopt the language of the kind of the new kind of, landlords. Then you do have to start to ask that question of, well, doesn't that mean that the English are also part British? They're also connected to the Romano-British who were there before the Anglo-Saxons came over. And you see this with everyone. People move, people migrate, people mix. We change language. When we think of the Welsh, I think because we know that the native British went to Wales and Cornwall, and in Wales in particular, they retained their language, which isn't the same language that it was then. And it actually, it changed just as English did. But because they have that Celtic language, we say, well, they're the originals because they speak Celtic. But again, it is language, what it means to say, well, because you speak a different language now, that means you're no longer, it'd be like saying if I went to Spain and I started speaking Spanish and never spoke English for the rest of my life, that means that I'm literally no longer English, which is just not true, because I came from England. I grew up in England and I've now moved over there. I speak a different language, but it doesn't remove that connection. I just think that's really important to kind of point out that, we tend to have this really anachronistic idea of identity when we look back at the past, and we try and group people into these neat categories of saying, you're these people, you're these people, you're these people, and these people came here, and then those are those people, and then it doesn't work like that. It's much more complex. And something else that I want to talk about is when we even try and group the Anglo-Saxons, and we say, well, these are the Anglo-Saxons. There's one, group, and it's like, again, it's not that simple because people would have had local ideas of identity. And even when you look at these kingdoms, and they, we know that there are differences in cultural behavior, burial practices, probably in dialect. I mean, we know that now, that there are different accents across England, and this goes back a long way. It's not a new thing. It didn't develop recently. It's old. It takes a long time for these kind of things to develop. So even now, when you go up to northern England and you speak to someone from Yorkshire, they're not just going to say, oh yeah, we're exactly the same. They're going to have a different accent. They're going to have many different cultural differences, different history, different understanding of what it means to be English, northern English versus southern English. Now imagine that 1,000 years ago, where people didn't have the internet, didn't have phones, would very rarely travel outside of their local community. And you really start to get more of an idea of what it meant to have kind of local understandings of identity rather than national identity. In later periods, even, your national identity really stemmed from the king. We both serve this monarch, therefore we are part of this cohesive whole. We are in the same kingdom, which is ruled by this king. And that's where it gets really interesting when people talk about Vikings, and they want to make this really clear-cut separation between Viking, Anglo-Saxon. They're different, and even then, people don't consider, one of the most glaring issues with that is when we consider the fact that England was ruled by Canute the Great, who was a Viking for 40 years, I believe it was. Danes settled in many parts of England, and stamped their identity everywhere. Many people know about the Danelaw, but they have this kind of view that the Vikings came over, the Great Heathen Army, etc., created the Danelaw. They were kind of in charge for a while, and then the English or the Anglo-Saxons drove them out and then retook everything. And no, it's really not that simple. People move around, and there were many Danish settlements, many Danish people who settled in communities throughout England, and stamped their own cultural identity. And then again, we amalgamated with those people. It's also not so simple when you consider the fact that Old Norse and Old English was very likely mutually intelligible. There would have been a much closer cultural identity between people from Scandinavia and the British Isles. I think something that's really interesting is when you do, just to kind of top off, is when people talk about this idea of native and what it means to be native, and something that I like to kind of point out is, for example, a place like Scotland, where people kind of think, Scotland is again, like Wales, the native people of this place, which again isn't exactly true. There was a very strong divide between southern Scotland and northern Scotland. And actually the name Scotland comes from the Scoti, which was an Irish name, because people from Ireland invaded what would later be called Scotland during the Romano-British retreat from Britain. And again, there was a kind of was it a complete takeover? Was it an amalgamation? We don't know exactly, but with the Picts, who originally lived in northern Britain, probably a mix, where they kind of coalesced, the Picts and the Irish Scoti. and created the Kingdom of Scotland. So again, are the Scottish native? You could argue that, many of them came from Ireland, so then they're not native. And how far do you go? Like, is Denmark too far away because Denmark's slightly further away than Ireland is from the mainland of Britain? So it's all about degrees, I guess, at that point. How far away do you have to be before, you know, um, you're a complete foreigner? So yeah, I just wanted to kind of address this because I feel like people are kind of making these videos talking about the Anglo-Saxons and what it means to be English, and the truth is that it's much more complex than that. People in the past didn't have this kind of understanding of nationality that we have today. Yeah, thanks.